She thought the rules of her neighborhood were unfair, too strict, too controlling. But no one could have imagined how far she would go to prove her power. One night, flames lit up the sky, and a family's safe haven was reduced to ashes. Yet, the real shock came days later, when the very woman suspected of destroying everything walked into a courtroom. Not as a defendant, but as someone demanding justice. How could this happen, and what dark truths about racism and power does this reveal? It was the kind of life many would call ordinary. Yet for Marcus, it was a life he had worked tirelessly to build. He was a father, a husband, and a homeowner, the kind of man who found joy in small routines. Each morning he walked his daughter to the bus stop, waving until the yellow bus disappeared down the street. In the evenings, he would water the patch of flowers his wife had planted in their front yard, a quiet reminder that beauty could thrive even in the middle of endless rules and restrictions set by their homeowners association. The house itself wasn't extravagant. It was modest, painted a warm beige, with a white porch railing Marcus had fixed himself one summer. To him, it was more than just a structure, it was a promise kept. A promise to his parents who had struggled all their lives in apartments where landlords barely remembered their names. A promise to his daughter that she would grow up in a place where she felt safe, with a backyard to play in and walls that belonged to them alone. But safety, Marcus would soon learn, was only an illusion. For months he had noticed the glares. A woman everyone in the neighborhood knew her as Karen watched him with eyes sharp as glass. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, a woman who carried clipboards like weapons and treated bylaws as though they were holy scripture. At first, Marcus brushed it off. After all, how much damage could a few nasty looks or petty complaints really cause? The first letter came tucked under his door, a violation notice for having his trash bins visible from the street. Then another for planting a flower bed without pre-approval. Soon, it became a pattern. Each week, some new warning, some new accusation, always signed with Karen's flourish at the bottom. His wife told him to ignore it, but Marcus felt the weight pressing down. It wasn't about bins or flowers. It was about something deeper, something unspoken but painfully clear. She didn't think he belonged there. Still, Marcus tried to keep peace. He paid the fines, moved the bins, even replanted flowers that had brought his daughters so much joy. Each concession chipped away at his pride, yet he reminded himself why he was there: for his family, for their future. But there were nights when unease settled in, heavy and undeniable. He would catch Karen's car idling near his driveway, headlights off, her silhouette barely visible behind the glass. He would see her scribbling notes on her clipboard as she stared at his house, as though cataloging every detail she planned to weaponize. Neighbors whispered, some in sympathy, others in silence. No one dared confront her. She was too powerful within the HOA, too relentless in her crusade. Marcus, however, had no intention of leaving. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to give in to someone else's prejudice. But he underestimated just how far Karen was willing to go. One evening, as Marcus tucked his daughter into bed, she asked him a simple question. "Daddy, why does that lady hate us?" He had no answer, no words that could soften the truth his little girl already sensed. All he could do was hold her hand and promise that their home was safe, that nothing bad could happen here. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. But deep down, he felt the storm gathering, a storm that would soon tear apart everything he had built, leaving behind ashes and questions that no one in the neighborhood could ignore. At first, the harassment seemed like an annoyance Marcus could manage. Petty fines, angry notes, unwanted glares. He told himself it was just part of dealing with a difficult neighbor. But soon, it grew darker, more deliberate. Karen began to show up at his property at odd hours, snapping photos of his lawn, his porch, even his car. She filed complaints with the HOA almost weekly, each one more absurd than the last. Too many guests parked outside his house, grass half an inch too long, curtains not neutral enough for the neighborhood standards. Marcus tried to laugh it off, but his wife stopped finding it funny. Their daughter grew nervous each time she saw Karen's car crawl past, slowing near their driveway. At night, The girl asked if the woman was spying on them, and Marcus, though he wanted to reassure her, could no longer deny the truth. Then came the vandalism. One morning, Marcus found his mailbox bent and splintered, as if someone had taken a bat to it. Days later, spray paint scrawled across his fence ugly words he couldn't bear to let his daughter see. The HOA claimed it wasn't their responsibility. Karen claimed she had no idea who could have done such a thing. Yet Marcus noticed her smirk at the next community meeting, a flicker of satisfaction she didn't bother to hide. He reported the incidents, of course, to the police, to the HOA, to anyone who would listen. But the responses were always the same. We don't have enough evidence. It could have been anyone. The unspoken message was clear. His voice didn't carry weight here. His pain didn't matter. The pressure built until it began to consume his life. Marcus started double-locking his doors, checking his security cameras every night, scanning the shadows outside before letting his daughter walk to the bus stop. What had once been his sanctuary now felt like a trap, a place where he was constantly watched, judged, and targeted. And still, Karen wasn't done. One evening, Marcus returned home from work to find an official-looking notice taped to his door. It wasn't just a violation, this was a demand to appear at an HOA hearing. The list of complaints stretched a full page, each one petty, but together they painted him as a troublemaker, a problem, an outsider who was lowering property values. It wasn't just about fines anymore. It was about control. It was about pushing him out. At the hearing, Karen sat at the center of the table, her voice dripping with false politeness as she read through the charges. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus defended himself, presenting photos, receipts, anything he could to prove he followed the rules. But it didn't matter. The decision had been made before he even walked into the room. That night, Marcus felt something snap inside him. For years, he had played by the rules. He had kept his head down, worked hard, paid every bill, and treated everyone with respect. And still, he was being hunted, cornered, punished for the simple act of existing where someone like Karen didn't think he belonged. He thought the worst was behind him. He was wrong. The fire came weeks later. It started just after midnight. Marcus awoke to the smell of smoke, the crackle of flames, the piercing shriek of the fire alarm. In seconds, panic exploded through the house. He rushed his wife and daughter outside, barefoot, coughing. The fire department called it suspicious. The insurance company dragged their feet. The police asked questions but offered no answers. And Marcus, standing in the ruins of his life, was left with a single terrifying thought. If Karen had done this, if she had burned his house to the ground, what would she do next? The smell of smoke never truly left Marcus's memory. Even weeks later, he swore he could still taste the ash at the back of his throat. His family had lost everything: clothes, photos, keepsakes, the fragile sense of security that came with calling a place home. Yet while he was still reeling from the fire, while investigators dragged their feet and insurance stalled with endless red tape, Karen made her move. He walked into the courthouse expecting to fight for justice, expecting at least a possibility of answers. What he didn't expect was to see Karen sitting calmly at the plaintiff's table, papers neatly stacked in front of her, as though nothing had happened. She wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to accuse him. Marcus's chest tightened. She claimed he was a nuisance homeowner, that his so-called negligence had put the neighborhood at risk, that his fire was somehow his fault. The words struck like blows. Each accusation twisted the knife deeper, as if the ashes of his home were now evidence against him. His attorney whispered strategies, legal points, ways to counter, but Marcus barely heard them. All he could see was Karen, her smug smile, her cold eyes, the quiet power she carried in a system that had always tilted in her favor. As she spoke, her tone was measured, practiced, dripping with false concern. She painted herself as the victim, a woman burdened with keeping the community safe from Marcus's carelessness. The jury nodded. The judge listened. And in that moment, Marcus felt the walls closing in. He wanted to scream that this was bigger than property disputes, bigger than a burnt house. He wanted to shout that it was about race, about being treated as an intruder in a place he had earned the right to call home. But the courtroom wasn't built to hear his truth. Each time he tried to speak, he was cut off, redirected, told to stick to the facts. And yet, the facts themselves had been bent, twisted, rewritten to suit Karen's narrative. His wife sat trembling behind him. His daughter clutched a worn teddy bear, too young to understand the legal language but old enough to sense the danger. In the room, Marcus looked at them, and something inside him shifted. He rose, his voice steady but burning with a fire deeper than any that had destroyed his home. He laid out the timeline, the harassment, the violations, the stalking, the vandalism. He spoke of the night of the fire, of the suspicious presence in the shadows, of the neighbors who had seen but stayed silent. He didn't have video evidence. He didn't have confessions. What he had was his truth, raw and undeniable. The room grew tense. Some jurors shifted uneasily. The judge's gavel struck, warning him to stay within bounds. But Marcus refused to be silent any longer. This was not just his fight, it was every fight. Every story of a family pushed out, every voice dismissed, every home turned battlefield because someone like Karen decided they didn't belong. He spoke until his throat burned, until his hands shook, until every eye in the room was fixed on him. And then silence. The gavel came down again. The judge's voice filled the room, cold and official. Decisions would be made. Evidence would be weighed. But Marcus knew that regardless of the outcome, something irreversible had happened. He had spoken the truth in a place designed to bury it. And as Karen's smile finally flickered, for the first time showing cracks in her armor, Marcus realized this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about exposing her. And the question that hung in the air was one no gavel could silence. Would the system protect her lies or finally confront the fire she had lit? The case dragged on for months, each hearing a reminder of the weight Marcus carried. The system moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if waiting for him to give up. Yet he didn't. Piece by piece, his attorney uncovered inconsistencies in Karen's claims. Witnesses who had once stayed silent began to step forward. A neighbor admitted they'd seen her near Marcus's property the night of the fire. Another revealed they had been pressured by her within the HOA. When the judgment finally came, it was not as clean or as satisfying as Marcus had hoped. Karen wasn't convicted of arson, there wasn't enough direct evidence, but the court dismissed her lawsuit against him, and the HOA was forced to acknowledge the years of targeted harassment. It was a small victory, but it was also a vindication. For the first time, the system had refused to bend entirely in her favor. Still, the victory came with scars. Marcus's home was gone. His daughter still woke from nightmares, asking if the fire would come back. His wife flinched at the sound of footsteps outside their temporary apartment. The life they had built had been reduced to ash, and no verdict could rebuild it overnight. And yet, Marcus stood taller, because through the wreckage, he had refused to be silent. He had spoken the truth in a room designed to ignore it. He had forced those who looked away to finally see. And in doing so, he carried not just his own story, but the story of so many others who had been told, in ways both subtle and violent, that they did not belong. This was never just about one house. It was about the illusion of safety that crumbles when prejudice and power collide. It was about how racism doesn't always wear a uniform or shout slurs, it often hides behind paperwork, policies, and polite smiles. It burns quietly, until, one day, it explodes into flames no one can ignore. Marcus's life would never be the same. But his fight left a mark on his community. A crack in the silence that had protected Karen for so long. Some neighbors who had once looked away began questioning their own role in allowing her power to grow unchecked. Others finally saw that what happened to Marcus could happen to anyone who was seen as other, and maybe, just maybe, that crack in the silence would grow wider, because Marcus's story is not unique. Across neighborhoods, cities, and towns, families face the same battles, sometimes against individuals, sometimes against entire systems that tell them they don't belong. The weight of those battles is heavy, and too often, justice comes too late or not at all. But his story is a reminder that silence protects the oppressor, not the oppressed. That speaking out carries risk, but silence carries something worse, the certainty that nothing will ever change. Marcus lost a home, but he kept his voice. And in the end, that voice became a weapon stronger than Karen's lies, stronger than the flames that destroyed his house. The question now isn't whether Marcus survived. He did. The question is whether we are willing to learn from what he endured. How many more families must watch their dreams burn before communities choose courage over comfort? How many more voices must be silenced before we start listening? And how many more homes must turn to ashes before we admit that the fire was never just in the walls, it was always in us?